We're in the money. We're in the money. Who think it's a bunch of guys in purple hoodies and they're your friends. No, they want to milk you for every penny you have.
Again, when you say it's just marketing, what is marketing but the systematic attempt to exploit behavioral science?
Fuck Activision Blizzard. Yeah. Fuck that company.
That's just bad business. That is on you. That's not just on these corporations.
Sit back, take a breather, and refresh here on the Rivalry Cooldown, where we bring you esports from the experts. On this week's show, we have Richard Lewis and Nahaz. As per viewer request, we wanted to pare our guests down a little bit and really dig into every topic. So welcome, you two. How is everything going for you today?
I'm alive. My body is operative. My mind is kind of there, so it should be a good show. I've just come off organizing an event for WSOE this weekend. So
yeah,
a lot
so
of work last week.
By the time this episode airs, Richard will be less alive because he'll be off of doing. He'll be coming out.
I actually won't be there this weekend. I won't be on site. I got some time off, so I've done the work component of it, and now I get to sit back and watch the fruits of my labor this weekend. So looking forward to that.
And Nahaz is coming off of vacation as well.
Yeah, good for you, man. Enjoy the time off. It was great. Everybody that hasn't already, my wife had to do quite a bit of convincing to get me to vacation in Chile, and it was amazing. It was one of the most fun places I've ever been.
Yeah, and he spammed plenty of pictures. So if you want to see more, you can check out Professor Nahaz on Instagram for all of your desires to go on vacation. He'll make you want to go there too. All right, guys. Well, thank you for joining us on today's cooldown. We have a few topics we're going to go through, but to start us off, I want to talk about something that I haven't seen very well explained yet. There's been some confusion with it, but it's definitely something that could have potential far-reaching impacts on the esports scene, and that's Article 13 in the EU. So I can explain what it is, or if one of you guys wants to take a stab at just kind of filling people in on the general outline.
Well, Nahaz is the professor. I have been researching this, funnily enough, for a video. I stayed off commenting on Article 13. I was kind of convinced it wouldn't pass in its current form. And then it did, and obviously it did for strange reasons, which we'll talk about in a sec. But I'm fairly boned up on it now. But I definitely want to hear a professor-style delivery of this thing rather than my more down-to-earth layman's take.
Oh, no, I think you probably know more about it than I do. I'm familiar only with the broad skeleton and my own concerns. And this is where you mentioned the professor thing. This is one of those topics I do feel like I need to give you a very professorial disclaimer, and that's that we are not legal experts here. We're very much armchair discussing this, and this is one of the big concerns that I have when I look at people, not only players and organizers in esports, but content creators. There are way too few people getting actual legal advice. And so if you are a content creator and your livelihood is potentially affected by something like this, you need to get in touch with somebody that has a law degree. And I will recommend either Ryan Morrison, Bryce Blum, or Ryan Fairchild. They're easy to find on Twitter. They respond to a lot of things. I know I've met Mr. Fairchild personally. He's a great guy. If you are somebody that has your livelihood tied up in this, you need to talk to somebody. And there are just, from players signing contracts to tournament organizers, there are way too few people talking to lawyers in esports as it is. That said, the big thing you need to know about Article 13 is that Article 13 it's in a way a passing of the buck by lawmakers. It's basically saying that individual sites are responsible for policing copyright enforcement. And the big concern that I have with this is pretty much that it's going to create a DMCA-like environment, like what we have on YouTube on a lot of different sites. The way that DMCA is written, it's not the same thing, but it's kind of similar in terms of the system of incentives that it creates, and that's that you end up with this strike system where, because it is ultimately the responsibility of the hosting site, if copyright material is posted, they have the incentive to make you guilty until proven innocent. So that when a strike is issued against you, regardless of its legitimacy, because they are the ones that are legally liable, they have the incentive to shut you down or to penalize you in the immediate term, regardless of whether there's any truth to it. And again, they do their due diligence and eventually follow up on this and eventually, hopefully, clear you. But when you're talking about people whose livelihood it is to get these videos up in a timely manner, and the fact that initial view counts, it's, YouTube videos, a lot of them are like blockbuster movies, that if you don't have a good opening first couple days or even opening 24 hours, you're never going to get those view numbers. So that's my big concern, is that it's a passing of the buck. It's inevitable because a lot of lawmakers don't have the expertise necessary to understand the different ways a lot of these sites operate. But I worry that it puts us more into these guilty until proven innocent situations.
And it's, to give a really understandable example, this is what happens with ESL. When initially ESL signed the Facebook deal, we definitely saw it happen in Dota. I'm not sure if it happened in Counter-Strike, but there were DMCA claims issued against streamers on Twitch who were casting as sort of a third party because ESL said, nope, this is our content, you can't have it, and Twitch had to take those streams down. Right. And ultimately, Valve has stated on several occasions, hey, nobody owns our game, anybody can cast it, stop DMCAing. And so these streamers get their streams back up, but it might be 24 hours later, the games are over, they're not maintaining their viewer base anymore, they lose the edge that they had by providing a service, and so that's that's an example of what we've seen already happen, and it could be.
I would have used a different example because I personally don't agree with that decision by Valve. I think that being able to monetize broadcast rights is part of the economic way forward that we need in esports. But your comments are very well taken, in that, again, the biggest problem is that the sites, knowing that if there is a violation, they will be liable for it, have every incentive to take a wait-and-see approach and say, okay, look, I'm sorry, we know this claim is probably bogus, but if it's not bogus, we're on the hook, along with the person that actually had the copyright violation. So we need to assume that everybody's guilty until proven innocent.
So, look, for those that haven't really been following this, and I understand why people would have a little bit of fatigue about this whole issue, and one of the reasons I genuinely believe that Article 13 hasn't blown up is because it's been 1 year since net neutrality passed. And if you remember, there was this hysteria, screaming, screeching about how net neutrality was going to end the internet as we know it. And in the past year, fuck all has changed, because it was never about that. Now, listen, I'm for net neutrality in principle, of course, but so far, the idea that commodification of the internet and corporatization of the internet hadn't happened before net neutrality is complete bullshit. Net neutrality in itself had only been around for a few years. It wasn't something that existed since the start of the internet. It was a thing that was brought in under the Obama administration and obviously was repealed in the Trump administration. And I think that kind of fatigue over that issue, where we were being told the internet will break as soon as this passes, it passes and nothing changes, and then we get Article 13 and everyone goes, hey guys, the internet's going to break again. Everyone's like, fuck this, I'm out, right? So that for me is a part of why this was able to pass and why not a lot of people globally know about this. But anyway, Article 13. It's part of this thing called the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market for EU, sometimes just called the EU Copyright Directive. And basically what it does is it puts emphasis by updating copyright law in this one specific Article 13, the titular 13. It's part of a broader document that basically websites that host material, Facebook, Google, YouTube, who have enjoyed special dispensations by saying we are not publishers, they now are being treated in part as if they are publishers, and they become responsible for any copyright violations on their platforms. Now, the key thing that gets lost in all the noise is people go, oh, this will lead to YouTube, is the big example everyone's talking about, banning delivery of, say, for example, I'm a big fan of Red Letter Media. They do movie critique. They have to use footage of movies in their videos, and therefore delivery of that to a European audience is now likely to be protected by an algorithm that will prevent people in EU from viewing it, because YouTube want to err on the side of caution and not have any copyright violations for which a movie studio could sue them rather than the content creator. Now, the key thing there is big companies, as you said, Nahaz, will be passing the buck. They'll create an algorithm that will completely insulate and protect them. And even though this directive, this article says parody and fair use is still protected, we all know the fundamental problem begins when big tech want to just insulate themselves from potential lawsuits. So in principle, the article is actually not as doom and gloom as what people think. It's just in practice, what will happen is already what we've seen happening on YouTube, on Facebook, where, as you said, you have to prove yourself innocent rather than they have to prove yourself guilty. So it is obviously, just on the surface, Article 13 itself, very bad. Of course, there's also Article 11, now Article 15, which is the meme ban, which obviously we'll talk about, but I'll let you just jump in and respond to that first.
The meme ban is something that is something interesting to me that may merit separate discussion. I think your parallel with net neutrality is actually pretty good, in that I think those of us who follow tech and follow the evolution of online economics and law understood that net neutrality wasn't a switch that was going to be flipped and all of a sudden the internet would change. We worried that it was greasing the wheels to a lot of very bad places that we didn't want to go. And I think that's, to me, the common thread here, right? We live in the age of liability, folks. And these big tech as firms, as Richard puts it, they need to protect themselves. Any qualified consultant or lawyer would tell them to be overly conservative, protecting themselves, because everybody knows they're out there with the deepest pockets, and they are therefore the most likely to get sued. And that's where the impetus from all of this comes. Number one, when the first big lawsuit gets filed and settled, and or number two, when the first big law firm retained by one of these companies says, look, you guys have your asses in the wind as far as liability exposure is concerned. You need to clean this the hell up, and you need to do it now, and it needs to be the nuclear option. So, yeah, I agree that the dogs and cats living together mass hysteria approach to these policies is not really good, but these are legitimate concerns, even if they're not, Y2K short run hysteria of the world's going to fucking end. Anyway, I worry that, again, this is going to exacerbate a lot of the trends that I already don't like. But, yeah, I'm very sensitive to the comment that, well, a lot of this stuff is going in that direction anyway.
What do you think we're going to see happen with Twitch? Because they are a live content platform, right? And everybody listens to music. A lot of people, will throw on a big fight that's on. And if they have 6 viewers, nobody cares because nobody can see it. And then after the fact, the VOD gets muted because Twitch, can monitor that. Do you think that they're going to have to develop additional tools? Some of the hysteria I've seen is just going to be that Twitch is just going to block any usage in the EU at all.
Yeah. Which is nonsense.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, understand that this being right. Okay, corporations. Twitch is a corporation, guys. It's owned by Amazon, one of the biggest corporations on planet Earth. I don't know how to break it to people out there who think it's a bunch of guys in purple hoodies and they're your friends. No, they want to milk you for every penny you have.
Well, and they fired all the guys who were in the purple hoodies that used to be.
Yeah, but even then, a lot of those guys, they didn't leave on principle when Amazon signed them up and gave them stock options and everything else. Understand, corporations are not your friend. They just pose as having morals and values when all they give a fuck about is the pursuit of money. That's what a corporation is. That's all they care about. So what the corporations are doing right now is framing it as, oh, bloody hell, this Article 13 is so terrible, and it'll have a profound impact on you, the viewer, the people we love, our consumers, the people who use our site. They're framing it as a them and us thing. This bill is being passed to protect corporations, right? So what does this tell you, okay? What they're doing is they are saying right now, we would much rather you, the consumer, rise up and oppose this legislation because it will cost us so much money to put these safeguards we will be compelled to do in place. The people that get crushed by Article 13 are the small tech businesses that can't afford to put sophisticated algorithms in place,
just like
safeguards in place.
Right. Just like the people that get crushed by the copyright strike system on YouTube are the small to mid-level guys that they can't necessarily afford to, or they don't know to hire a lawyer to help them respond and to help them understand what fair use is. That's part of the problem. Again, I am very sympathetic to Richard's take about corporations in this space, and that a lot of them, it's kind of like corporations in esports and gaming. In some ways, they act like colonizers. They're very extractive. They come in and they're looking to put the natives to work and convert us all to Christianity or some shit. All right. But look, the other part of this, we do need to grow up a little and educate ourselves. Okay. If you are producing content on the internet for a living and you do not know what fair use means, that's just bad business. That is on you. That's not just on these corporations who I agree are greedy and who I agree have made some really, we'll talk about this separately, I imagine. There's some corporations that have made some very suspect decisions in gaming industry and the markets have punished them for it. But, this is the world we live in, guys. And enforcing copyright law is really hard on the internet. It's going to be really expensive. Somebody's going to end up paying for it. And we, the consumers, are probably going to end up foisting part of that burden.
And we're not going to be able to meme anymore.
Well,
just before we jump into the meme ban, just to come back to the point, will Twitch stop serving content to EU audiences to protect themselves? Absolutely not, because of how that would eat into their bottom line.
Right.
Creating a aggressive algorithmic safeguard or a safeguard that takes another form it will be a lot more cost effective than just having no EU broadcasts to minimize risk. That will never happen because of how Twitch makes its money. Here's what will happen, because this is what happens every time something passes that can impact on these big tech companies. First thing, they will go back to bringing in really obtrusive copyright safeguards. Think of the way that for a period of time before Twitch got that mute the VOD thing in place, they were just telling content creators, you can't play music. If you play music, we'll just ban you. And there was a number of high-profile bans for people who literally were playing copyrighted songs in the background, which, by the way, from a legal point of view, there's an argument to be made in court that me playing a song in the background while I play a video game and talk over the top of it could in no way be a substitute for the original product.
That's right.
So
that's the transformative clause under fair use, right? But again, that's where that's what bothers me, is that the majority of these discussions, I am not a legal expert, but I feel like I can at least give some informed speculation, some analysis of the incentives involved. That what bothers me is that the majority of this discussion of these issues that I see online are just not informed at all. And that's a really dangerous thing, because this does affect a lot of people's livelihood.
Sure. And again, look, like when it came to net neutrality, obviously I want to have net neutrality in place. When it comes to being opposed to Article 13 and the directive on copyright and the digital single market, yes, of course, I'm opposed to that passing and anything that is likely to egregiously shut down free speech, fair use, critique, Obviously, I'm against all of those things. The thing that I don't like is that you do get these weird disinformation campaigns that spring up where, again, and this is pretty much...
on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's like, it's a bad thing, guys. For the reasons I've just cited, you don't need to exaggerate and say, we'll never be able to use memes on the internet again. Highly unlikely. There is a special provision within this directive that says parody is protected. So for any reason, right, if it were to go to court, that would be the argument you would use, and you would be completely fine. Of course, by the time it gets there, you're probably out of pocket quite a bit. The issue is rather what protections will be brought in place to align with Article 13 and the EU Copyright Directive. And just as an interesting aside, which I suppose we can use we'll bring this up a little bit later when we get to the politics section of what we're going to be talking about today. But Brexit, Brexit is obviously the breakaway of the EU and potentially the single market. So we get to this weird situation where if Britain were to break away from Brexit, there is actually a situation that could arise where they wouldn't necessarily have to adopt Article 13. They would need to make a decision about that. In the past, what Britain has always done is it has always signed up to what's called the General Data Protection Regulation. We wouldn't necessarily have to do that in Britain. So I wonder if a lot of these Article 13 naysayers suddenly get behind Brexit. Who knows? Just goes to show, like, it's never what you when you get on your little causes and you wave a flag without truly understanding broader context and nuance, maybe don't do that and look into some shit. But anyway, that's an aside.
There's also the issues with Article 13 that the voting order was changed.
Yes.
And a bunch of people have come forward and said, I didn't mean to vote for that. This was a different order than what I was prepared for, which on the one hand is stupid because it's literally their job to read. It is their job. But on the other hand, when I look at that and I look at what's happening with Brexit, and that I believe there was also a very important vote about Brexit the day after that Article 13 passed, I wonder, like, what manipulations are happening? Like, what's the greater political picture here? Is it about protecting corporations? Is it about, there's so many, integrated issues going on right now. It's really hard to look at one and just say, oh, this is why this camp is advocating for it.
I mean, I don't think that they're necessary. Again, I think you can tell plenty of conspiracy theory-esque stories, but I think most of them get cut pretty deeply by Occam's razor. You look at the digital environment right now, and I think just look at how long it's taken us, even in the States, to start collecting sales taxes on Amazon. Right? I mean, the law is way, way, way behind the internet environment. And it has been for some time, and it arguably will continue to be. And unfortunately, we're in an equilibrium right now where most of the lawmakers, I mean, they don't understand the issues that they're voting on most of the time, much less something like this. And so they have every incentive to basically say, okay, we have a bunch of lobbyist groups that, including for example, the music industry, that are saying, look, these websites need to be held accountable for their use of copyrighted material. You have a group of lawmakers that doesn't really know how to do it. And in fact, I'm not sure that there is one uniform set of rules that would apply equally well to all these different types of distribution platforms. And so you have lawmakers say, well, the easiest solution is just to make the site on which the material is hosted responsible. It's not a great solution, but again, I think that there's a broad recognition that there need to be laws in place for these things.
And just as well, the way that the whole vote has been handled, again, it's very interesting. You've got people beating their chest about how we need to have a second vote on Brexit because of lies that were supposedly, I mean, as if it's the only election that ever happened in human history where lies were told. We've got some news for you there, folks. But less of a fuss has been made about the sort of weird gerrymandering that went on around the critical vote for this copyright directive in Strasbourg, which basically, as you said, Nessa. They changed the order of the voting, and people got confused about it and weren't too sure what they were voting for. In particular, Swedish members of the European Parliament really fucked up. So there's two ways of looking at this. The fact that they shifted the order and shifted the vote around, so there was a confusing component to the vote, sounds a little bit like gerrymandering. The other component is that this was just common or garden incompetence, which doesn't surprise me out of Swedish politicians, frankly. But what I would say is, either way, if they come out and they say, listen, we voted on the wrong thing, and you could go back and historically look that their voting doesn't reflect their positions, you absolutely have to have another vote at that point. Keep in mind as well, the entire vote lasted just 16 seconds. This isn't a long, convoluted process. This is literally like what happens when you go into a general election and you press a little box on an electronic machine. So look, what happened here was there were 10 MEPs that meant to vote yes to put an amendment in place, but accidentally voted no or accidentally abstained from the vote. There were 2 other MEPs that were meant to vote no to amended, but they voted yes by accident. So it was both sides that were confused. It wasn't just one side that fucked up. This is how you know that there was obviously something weird going on. And there was one MEP that abstained on amending, but voted no to amend the directive by accident as well. Now, if you rejig all of the voting numbers, the final vote would have been 319 for an amendment, 314 against an amendment. Those are the fine margins we're talking about. And the European Parliament would have been compelled to have a discussion about which amendments in the directive are going to be changed. Now, how it often works with the European Parliament, for those who don't know, and one of the reasons why there were people who were pro-Brexit is they can just go away now and make a very minor change, very similar to filibuster, I believe it's called, filibustering or whatever, in the US. Where you just add a weird little amendment clause to try and stop a broader thing passing in Parliament. But basically, you know, it could be something small and meaningless. And then they just get resubmitted an infinite amount of times, just infinitely. There's no chance of stopping.
That's the analogy to filibuster, is the mechanism, mechanism of parliamentary procedure by which a bill can just be held up indefinitely by a very small or even one person.
Yeah. So I mean, look, the whole vote was a shambles. At this point, they should absolutely just have a re-vote on the basis that the voting mechanisms were compromised. I mean, that's fair enough. This isn't a lie. This isn't, we need to have a complete vote because people were lied to. That's part of the course in politics, unfortunately. This is literally the mechanics of the vote were faulty, so you do need to do it again, in my opinion. So, I mean, that's a large thing. Now, whether or not that'll happen, I don't know. But I would be all for actually having the vote reflect what people wanted to vote when they pressed the button.
That seems like a very hard position to argue against, quite frankly.
It just depends on, what precedent is and what the rules they have are, I suppose. Now, there was something that Nahaz said that I'd sort of like to circle back to about laws not really being up to date with the internet era that we're in. And we see that in things like loot boxes. And that and that also brings up something we were discussing before we went live about some of the conspiracy theories around Anthem now and microtransactions in games. And so the game system and how we spend money on games has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. It's gone from buying a single AAA title for your console or, like a single PC game to these online giant games with microtransactions and loot boxes and, designed to be either addictive or manipulative and these other things. So I sort of want to, get into that topic. And I think we can start off with the Anthem conspiracy theory that's floating around right now.
Well, I'll let you start with that.
Go ahead. I think it sounded like, based on our pre-air conversation, that you had followed that more closely than I have. So if you want to give us the quick primer.
Yeah, well, I'm always keeping an eye on these big companies and what they're doing with loot boxes, because my position has shifted over the years. I was very, I used to make the argument it's the same as, Panini stickers for soccer albums when I was a kid, or baseball cards. or even a Kinder Egg, right, where you get a toy inside, and some toys are definitely better than the others, and collect the set. Or what else did I used to get as a kid? Shit, I used to buy these things called Muscle Men, which were like rubber wrestlers, and you would get one rare one in each tub, and obviously to collect the set of rares, you would have to buy more and more tubs. Now, these, to me, are not predatory practices. That's just marketing, or at least that's how I used to think about it. Now I'm not so sure. I don't know if I still consider it. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if I consider it gambling anymore, but what I do know is I can no longer be sympathetic to these big companies because they have, to use a British colloquialism, they've took the fucking piss. They've absolutely abused what is the boundaries of good taste, fair marketing practices to, again, maximize profit at the expense of children, at the expense of vulnerable individuals, at the, and they use... they use methods in loot boxes, which are now provably, there's scientific papers to back this up, that are the same as people who get addicted to gambling. The mechanics are the same. The way to dopamine.
But again, it's a tough line to draw, right? Because it reminds me a lot of these companies that pay extra to have their product put at eye level on the grocery store shelf, right? I mean, there are. Again, when you say it's just marketing, what is marketing but the systematic attempt to exploit behavioral science to affect a consumer's purchases?
Absolutely.
So, I mean,
absolutely.
It's pretty clear to anybody that's paying attention that there is a line there somewhere, but I do think that line is more difficult to pinpoint. And, Nessa, I think when you talk about the history of all this, I think it dates back to a discussion that we had maybe even on the very first show, and that's about digital distribution platforms and Steam versus Epic. And when you think about the history of gaming economics, right, the price of a AAA title fundamentally really hasn't changed in the last 15 years.
$50 to $60 for a very long time.
And the way that those... obviously inflation is a thing, even if it's very small, and costs are going up to develop these games. And the way that the kind of equation was balanced was the distributor's margin was shrinking and shrinking partially as a result of moving to digital distribution platforms. And we've I think everybody agrees that we've sort of very nearly hit the limit of that. Especially when you're talking about, Epic potentially offering 12%, which is another discussion entirely. But the evolution of this idea of games as a service, which collectively I think covers all of this, came from the desire of these companies to say, look, we have to, the costs are continuing to go up. Research has shown the idea of trying to charge people more than $60 for a AAA title has been explored. And with the exception of these gold and silver and collective editions, people just won't. They just won't do it empirically. And, you want to talk about something that triggers me about as badly as loot. I think that there are arguments for and against both things. But another thing that triggers me, for example, if you look at the release of The Division 2, where if you bought the gold edition for $90 or however it was, you got to play 3 days early. And in a looter shooter where a big component of that, like Anthem as well, where a big component of that game is being like one of the first on the server to get to that max level gear, being the first to complete your proverbial set of digital muscle men, to use his Richard's language. That's a big part of the consumption value that you're getting. And all of a sudden, you're not just making an extra $30 by selling that $90 game. You're eating into the surplus of the people that are paying $60 for the title. And that's kind of what I worry. So that's the thing that I worry most about with these loot boxes is, are we in the process of capturing, in the great price discrimination landscape? I'm giving a lecture about this on Tuesday. Sorry, that's where my brain is anyway. But in the great price discrimination landscape, the idea is you want to capture surplus from those guys higher up on the demand curve with those higher willingnesses to pay. Great. In the process of doing so, though, you don't want to eat into the surplus from your core customers that are just willing to pay $60. They want to play the game, and that's it. And that's that's where I really start to get concerned with some of these practices where you're algorithmically matching people against people with better gear, and you're preying.
Yeah, so that's what's happening.
Predatory.
The Anthem conspiracy, I believe, when I briefly looked at it, is just that the game is intentionally matching you against people better equipped than you, so that you feel the need to spend money.
Right.
So then they're making more money off of you so that you can level up to play against, people and be on an equal playing field. That's a conspiracy.
It's ironic to me because the game wasn't really sold as PvP anyway, but
that's what a lot of people look for in games, though. So
I think when you look at a lot of these games like WoW, right, that it's an interesting consumption problem because very few people play the game primarily for PvP, but the presence of a PvP component is clearly welfare enhancing even to a lot of people that spend most of their time playing PvE, right? The option to go in and occasionally compete against other players, even if you don't actually do it, right? It's kind of fun to think about. Again, that's where we have these discussions in economics all the time in all different industries is where does the line between good marketing cross over into predatory practices?
Well, and if you look at EA, they just laid off, it's about 4% of their workforce because, Battlefield 5 and Anthem both did not go over particularly well for them.
You have to be really, really careful right now with a lot of the analysis of BioWare is separate, okay? And that's Activision Blizzard is what I should have said. My mind was on BioWare because we were talking about Anthem, but the analysis of Activision Blizzard and their situation is entirely separate. There's I'm sorry, but if you're a third-party economist looking at what Activision Blizzard has done over the last 8 to 12 months, it's very hard to look at that situation and not think that there's been major management malpractice committed there. But setting that aside for a minute, you're going to see a lot of contraction from a lot of different gaming firms, and that's partly because the economic environment right now overall is looking like it could be pretty brutal. I mean, we've had one of the more strongly inverted yield curves in quite some time recently. I personally think the next 18 months is going to be a pretty decent size correction, which how that's going to affect the political landscape is another kind of interesting question. But if I'm EA right now, I don't have to be looking at my previous games to justify laying off 4% of my employee base. You don't have to be good at reading tea leaves to say that as a media firm right now, you might want to be a little bit leaner.
Yeah, I have a few numbers here. So for Blizzard, their value per share in 2018 was $2.60. And in 2019, it's gone down to $2.10, which is about a net loss of $400 million.
And that's kind, by the way. Like there are.
Yeah, I've heard bigger numbers than that.
Yeah, that is. I mean, their financials are scary, and it's hard to look at that company as a value proposition and argue that the intrinsic value of their product has taken that kind of a dive. So it's one of those dog that didn't bark kind of scenarios. But anyway.
Yeah, and then the numbers for EA, it went from $4.39 down to $3.85. So it was like a net about a loss of $150 million. So a lot of their layoffs were in marketing and analytics. And I think they had a lot of people in Russia and Japan, which were markets that just weren't panning out. And so that's kind of the story behind EA. But if you think about Anthem and you think about a lot of the laws that have been coming out about loot boxes, these companies are having almost a harder time finding revenue streams now that laws are catching up. And they, potentially are having more competitors in the space. I mean, even look at something like Apex.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people are operating with that premise. Are you convinced by that argument, Richard? Because I'm not. I think it's largely right, but I'm not quite sure that's what's going on.
Look, the whole loot box, the whole thing for me is that flaunting laws that have been in place to protect consumers now seems to be part of the modus operandi of a lot of big game developers, and they are definitely doing this now as par for the course. For example, when Belgium brought in legislation against the FIFA loot boxes, EA quickly mobilized the legal team to fight the decision of the Belgian government. Now, why on earth would you do this? It's like, seems to me you just take it on the chin. You still get to sell your loot boxes.
Come on, Richard. You don't. That no. You look. That's a thing. Advocacy is a thing. It's part of rent-seeking behavior. We don't have to like it, but it is part and parcel. That if you're the problem of research and development and dynamic rent-seeking behavior is codependent. And if you've already spent your R&D budget developing a product, and somebody comes along and through legislation tries to destroy the economic viability of that product, you are going to protect it. It's not the corporations defending their interests in court is not itself evidence of malfeasance. Now, I agree that you can point to plenty of examples of extremely predatory practices that have been defended.
Just as an additional fact, before we get into discussing this, sure. Blizzard took it on the chin. Valve took it on the chin.
Right. Yeah.
Take-Two took it on the chin, and they removed loot boxes from the games in that country. Right? Like they said, okay, the Belgian Gaming Commission has said that the way we've been handling loot boxes is now illegal form of gambling. EA didn't want to do that. Yeah. EA make too much money from FIFA, and that's all they care about. And they're willing to assemble a legal dream team to fight the whim of a government that is actually trying to pass legislation to protect its citizens from predatory practices, and in particular children and underage gamblers, people who could, legally couldn't walk into a casino and gamble, and yet they're being exposed to these predatory practices through FIFA, which is, of course, EA's huge money spinner. No game comes close.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
The amount of money that FIFA does.
No, it's right. You look at the amount of money that Madden makes in the States, and you look at the viability of those games that are very low development costs. That once you have it up and running, you can spin one out every year, and then you look at the international popularity of football, and FIFA is going to be a huge moneymaker. The problem, it's just I've worked on too many consulting cases where, at the end of the day, the guy that ends up fighting something in court that you really wish hadn't been fought is almost always the guy that just had the most to lose from passing it. So I'm reluctant to I'm reluctant to draw too big a moral divide between the guys that took it on the chin and the guy that didn't, because most of the time the guy that didn't take it on the chin is simply the guy that had the most invested to start with. Look, part of this relates to online gambling too, that I know we've all talked about and we all care about. That the part of the problem is that it feels like the companies that try to signal responsible practices don't get rewarded. Mm-hmm. That bugs me, right? We spend all of our time talking about the guys that are assholes, and the people that actually do try to promote a healthy ecosystem. It doesn't feel like there's that much of a reward for it.
Mm.
It's easier to talk about something negative.
Yeah.
You see that trend on everything.
Politics too.
You get positive reinforcement in interaction from negative things. You get rewarded from that. So positive things, they definitely get light on them a lot less. But there is something you said, so EA has the most to lose. So obviously they fight for it. So don't want to talk about morals there. If you look at Valve, I believe, China passed a few laws, and so now they have to publish the drop rates of their chess now. And China, Westerners argue all the time about how Valve needs to spend more money on this, and Valve needs to care more about this, and especially with the issues going on with China and visas and all the drama that we've had in the Dota scene. I don't think people realize how much money Valve makes from Dota in China.
It is, your statement is correct, but it's so much worse than that.
Well, in China now,
even if it were just about the current revenue share, it would be one thing. My big concern is that, when you look at Valve's business model and you look at, do they have room to grow? And you look at a product like Artifact, and you look at,
that has room to grow.
Can they continue to do what they've been doing and grow at the rate that they've been growing. Again, I don't have access to their internal data, and I couldn't talk about it if I did. But it's hard as an economist to answer that question with yes until the magic out card comes in, and that out card is China. Valve has such a strong economic incentive to keep China happy because China is their magic bullet right now. China is their pathway to business as usual. Otherwise, I think if Valve tomorrow got out of China, I think that company would have to dramatically restructure to meet anything like what they've done over the last 10 years.
So again, I mean, look, when it comes to Valve, I think things are a little bit different. I actually welcomed it. I mean, look, it's not often something that comes out of China that has a positive impact on Westerners, but the reality is that I think these odds should have been shown right from the get-go.
Agreed.
That is just a basic. You know, we talk about, you know, when you get a drink from a store. It took, how long did it take for them to have to list all the ingredients on the side of the bottle so you knew you weren't drinking some dubious chemical as a sugar substitute or something like that? Well, you know, that's a consumer right. It's the same for when I decide to open one of these chests. I should know going in, what are the odds of me getting that super rare item that I want? And what's really interesting is that while all this was going on in real world, like baseball cards, Magic the Gathering cards, you know, whatever it was, you always had a much better understanding approximately. I distinctly remember, you know, knowing which cards were rare and hard to get and roughly how many packs I'd have to buy if I wanted to get the card I wanted. This seemed to get phased out gradually because mobile gaming came in and, somewhere in, I want to say the noughties, there was the concept of the whale, and games development companies and just marketing companies in general understood that you could put out a free or low-cost product that had microtransactions or supplementary transactions, and you could basically manipulate people who had bigger incomes or were more susceptible to spend money to offset the fact you were giving a service at a lower cost to other people.
Clash Royale or whatever the game that's competitive is, isn't that just the more money you have, the better you are at it?
I mean, legitimate pay to win is pretty much in every mobile game. I mean, and the games development companies, the big ones, who, by the way, here's a reason why I never minded craptacular piece of shit mobile games doing this, because they're fucking usually free. So they've got to actually, make that money. And B, generally they don't have huge player bases because they don't have the marketing arm to broadcast them to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world. What started happening was AAA development companies started looking at how they were making money at these mobile games companies.
You have to.
And said, hey, we sell a product $60. And we're going to take all these freemium mechanics and put them into our game. And sometimes even to the detriment of the game. Because, you know, for example, we've had Call of Duty.
Star Wars Battlefront 2.
Right, Battlefront. Call of Duties. That
Which should have been an awesome game.
Campaign. Oh, should have been. But, of course, what do they care about first?
So I'm still furious about that, by the way.
Oh, has that been 2 years since the... I mean,
I knew people that worked on that game. Like, it had the ingredients to be a really, really fun game, and it just, I think, you know, the artifact story, you know, not to piss off Valve even more, is like the other end of that.
Too late for that. Double down on it, brother.
Yeah, it's artifact. They can't defend themselves anymore.
The game economics, the transactional model, okay, how the player interacts with the game over time, not in the context of a specific match, how you show progress or improve or accumulate these cosmetics. That is a first order important piece of the gaming experience. You can't just say, oh, I have this game. It's a great shooter. It's got great mechanics. It's super fun to play. The rounds are great, but the player progress mechanics completely fucked up. You have to pay to play. It's pay to win. You know, that is all thrown into the same pot as far as the player experience is concerned. And look, Richard, you're not going to find somebody you're not going to find somebody that actually plays games that's much more sympathetic to the situation that these corporations are in than I am, because again, historically, you got to push those margins somewhere. But yeah.
I'd agree. I agree. Look, I have nothing against making profit. I've got nothing against, good old fashioned capitalism. I'm a little bit of a lefty, but not that much. But the reality is that when I see, Bobby Kotick come out, for example, and say, "Hey, we had a record year again, guys," but we're also laying off thousands of employees, many of whom didn't get told in advance when they were going to be laid off. They were literally told we're going to lay off 1 in 4, but we don't know who it is yet. So keep working hard, guys. Fuck Activision Blizzard.
Yeah.
Fuck that company forever.
When is it going to?
Bobby Kotick too.
When is it going to happen? Like you've seen in other big industries, and I realize esports and gaming has a long way to go in terms of its growth before we talk about it as a big industry. Like $1 billion industry, guys, is not that big anymore. But there are CEOs in other industries that essentially have their own speechwriters, that have their own PR people on retainer to protect them from exactly that thing. People in esports and in the gaming industry are just collectively, they are legendarily bad at public relations. It's exceptional to me, the amount of money that is left on the table because people are PR morons. My God, if you are an undergraduate right now interested in gaming, get yourself a marketing degree because we need you.
Yeah. But look, it's almost as if when you're a multi-millionaire or billionaire,
you think you should.
Yeah, you don't understand. You don't understand how normal people live or what normal people want to hear. I remember there was an instance where I think it was Sainsbury's, a big supermarket chain in the UK. They just did some merger with some other big company, but this was going to mean that there was going to be a reduction in employees. There was a lot of people going to lose their jobs. So to explain this situation, they sent the chairman of the board onto the BBC news broadcast, and while he was mic'd up, sat there in a chair, he was singing, "We're in the money, we're in the money." Wow. And somebody leaked the recording of that. And it's this tone-deaf bullshit from corporations. Yeah. And millionaires and billionaires that puts everyone's nose out of joint, and rightly fucking so.
Yeah. You're old enough. You're old enough, Richard. Do you remember? Did you follow basketball at all? Do you remember Michael Jordan?
I put it this way. I do remember Michael Jordan. Obviously, my franchise was the Seattle SuperSonics, and then I tapped out.
I was a huge Gary Kemp fan, but anyway. So I'm sorry, Sean Kemp, Gary Payton. So here you go. At the end of his career, right, we all remember Michael Jordan's stint with the Wizards where he went into being an executive. And he eventually has found some success in that arena, but with Charlotte. But the first time that Michael Jordan was a team executive, it was an abject disaster. And I remember at the time, I'm 90% sure it was Charles Barkley. Being Barkley, everybody asked, do we think Michael Jordan is going to be effective as a basketball executive? And everybody said, oh, yeah, he knows as much about the game as anybody. Got a great report with the players. Barkley gets asked this question. He says, no, he's going to be terrible. And the room goes silent, as you would imagine. And they ask Charles why. And he says, because right now Michael Jordan is surrounded by an arsenal of people that will never tell him no. And that to me is what happened. Gaming is still, and esports are still small enough that a lot of CEOs, CFOs, what have you, at these development houses are still the studs, the big men, and they're surrounded by people that won't tell them no. And that, as the industry is growing, that is increasingly a problem.
All right, guys. So that is it for this episode of The Cooldown. Thank you for joining us. As always, like, subscribe, comment, share, let people know where to find this, and let these guys know what you think and any topics you'd like to hear about in the future. This was Richard Lewis and Nahaz on the Rivalry Cooldown. We'll see you guys next time.